Hello. So, my name is Seth Dellinger, and this podcast is called Embodied Dialogue. And I'm delighted that along with me today is Daniel Garner. And Daniel, I'm going to do the briefest of introductions because as we've been chatting a little bit before hitting record, I'm really just getting to know you, and I'm excited to let that unfold. But I know you as a philosopher. I know you've written a number of books. The most recent one, I believe, is called Belonging Again. And I've also, when I was writing an article recently where I referenced you, I also called you an unorthodox musical educator. So hopefully those two phrases will already get people wondering a little bit about you. And I want to invite you in a moment to just say more background. But the other framing is that both of us are connected to Aspasia Karageorge, who's in Sydney, Australia. She's a psychologist there, and she came up with this phrase, authentic resonance. And there are two subsequent discussions. I can put them in the show notes, but she spoke to me about this, spoke to you, and who knows, possibly the three of us will have a conversation further down the road. But so that's kind of like how we got to know each other. And the last thing I would say, and then just feel free to riff on any and all of this, is this virtual place where we are sitting today having this conversation is a place that some people call the liminal web. In other words, there's this phenomenon of these podcasts. Who knows how many will watch this one, but there's podcasts coming out every day. And it's not so strange these days for a couple of folks like you and I who haven't previously met to just get on a call, hit record. We're going to put it on the internet. But you've been doing quite a lot of this over the last few years. And because of what you've written, a lot of people are interested in what you have to say. But there's all kinds of topics. And so I guess one piece that would be interesting to ask is just like, what is the liminal web? And we can get to, I think, this topic of authentic resonance that Aspasia began with. But you know, just to begin, if there's anything you'd like to say about how you got here, it could start with when you were born, or you could summarize a little more. But I'm kind of curious to just learn a little bit more about you, and then situate ourselves in the liminal web. And then we'll see if we get to authentic resonance, if that sounds okay to you.
That sounds magnificent. And I remember dial-up internet, and I remember the world before the internet. And I remember when you had to blow in the cartridge of the NES so it worked and you could play Duck Hunter. And then when my brother and I found out that you can actually control a duck with the other controller and shoot at it, that was world changing. And so, to start with birth and different things. It's a pleasure to be here, Seth. I really appreciate your work. And I think that what you're doing on connecting the body to thinking and that the whole body thinks is extremely important. I don't know where 30 minutes went just speaking, just like that, as we were talking about. I'm extremely interested in what some people call the counter-enlightenment. I'll also talk about the modern counter-enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment. And basically all of them warned that if thought is separated from the body, from the common life, from the community, the land, then it becomes this self-referential activity that ultimately becomes auto-cannibalistic. And what that word means is it eats itself, like the snake, right? And because when David Hume famously deconstructs isness and oughtness, he says you can never get from is to ought. That was not him saying that there was no possibility of ethics. What he was saying is that ethics must be based on suchness. The word he uses is common life, or the immediate experience. And the reason he's saying that is because if I can come up with a moral theory for what cats are do based on my definition of a cat, the isness of a cat, well, then I can kind of totalitarianly and oppressively control all cats around the world based on my definition. And I lose the nuance and particularity of the barn cat by the road that has spots that my children want to feed, but I won't let them feed because it's a barn cat and we'll have to raise one from birth. The particularities of that cat is different from the cats in the city, right? So he wants to bind us to suchness. And really, I think the task of philosophy today has a lot to do with turning us to suchness from isness. But this is very difficult because the brain understands suchness through what? Isness, through categories. So you have to have this constant activity where you're reminding your brain that ideas are not experiences, and yet the way that you understand experiences is through ideas. So there's already a challenge with being human that we have to work through constantly. And we also entail a certain self-forgetfulness, as in when we use ideas, we tend to forget that we're using ideas. And we tend to forget that, how did Harabowski, S.I. Karabowski, they always said, you do realize that the word water is not wet. And you say, well, of course. But actually you forget that in the use of it. You actually treat the thing of water like the word. The signifier becomes the signified. And I think a lot of philosophy is that very task. And I would say my interest in philosophy stems from precisely this tendency of human beings to, one, lose sight of suchness, lose sight of the particular, to be ironic, to have this very tendency of, in trying to understand what water is, we use an idea that then keeps us from accessing what the thing is, and then we forget we did that. We're prone to irony. The brain is not your friend, but it's also not your enemy, it's your frenemy, right? And you see, the issue is philosophy, in my opinion, because we were talking about, like, why do philosophy? What is philosophy? Philosophy is not merely an analysis, but it is also a meta-analysis of analysis. It is thinking about thinking. It is thinking about the way that your brain works. And the love of wisdom, if we take philosophy as love of wisdom, if wisdom is some sort of applied knowledge, some sort of discernment and judgment and action all together, wisdom does not merely seem to be a single activity. It seems to be a concert of activities. Wisdom seems to be more like Beethoven's Ninth, where all the instruments and people make wisdom when they all work together, all parts of the body, judgment, senses, everything. It's not just thinking, it's a symphony of activities. Well, if one wants to do wisdom well, then you also have to include this meta-analysis of our own self-forgetfulness and our own tendency to confuse ideas with experiences and our own tendency to forget the body and to forget common life and different things. So I'd say my interest in philosophy, because I did a lot in like economics, religion, literature, and different things, was reading a lot of literature and seeing that, wow, we really don't have a good understanding of what human beings are. Because when I look at economics and it says human is the rational animal, or I look at the Enlightenment and it says something about human beings, you know, progressing and getting smarter and different things. But when you look at the great literature, it's a constant story of how people's good ideas get them in trouble, or how they forget the things that matter in the name of their goals, or all of these tragedies, trade-offs of competing goods. So the kind of person you saw in literature did not seem to match the kind of person that was being assumed in economics, that was being assumed in politics, sociology, and all of these different things. And then the world seemed to get increasingly crazy, in these different problems. You saw these failures of economic models. You saw these black swan events continue to occur. And it became increasingly, in my opinion, the case that the character of the human being that was being assumed throughout the society was not actually what human beings are, which is more of this walking contradiction, to use a phrase you hear in some songs, right? Well, the funny thing is, philosophy seems to be the necessary prerequisite for really getting that human beings are this walking contradiction, and not solving that problem, but learning the art of that problem. Philosophy, I think, is more of an art form in a lived regular experience, the love of wisdom, versus a category of a history of thought that you memorize what Aristotle and Plato said and all of that, and then, you get your PhD or something, right? Philosophy is more of this love of being wise in every situation you're in. Like, love has a commitment to it, right? So it's a love of wisdom is also a kind of commitment to wisdom, and wisdom is an application in an immediate situation. So you are in love with figuring out how to be present in situations where your brain doesn't take over your body, or your body doesn't take over your brain, or you're not outsourcing from your own judgment to something external, but you also are able to be humble when you don't know what you're talking about, but then you're also able to be confident. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of decision making you have to make. Yes. And I think that means if philosophy is about the love of figuring that out and commitment to that process, well, now we're talking about something like the resonance that Aspasia was talking about, right? We are talking about that authentic resonance, which is also, again, the phenomenology of the artist. This is the kind of thing that the artist does. But to tie to your question on my interest in the liminal web, and then I'll give it back to you, this presents a massive problem now. Because, okay, so the way that we need to deal with the growing complexity of economics, government, politics, and all of these different things is a more complex, if we use complexity side, like a complex understanding of the subject, doesn't that mean everyone needs to do philosophy? Well, that doesn't sound good, because it sounds kind of oppressive. You're saying the world would work if everyone did what I did. Oh yeah, that seems to be a problem. And yet, if philosophy is not a particular way of thinking, but a mode of being that could be customized per every individual relative to their diversity and unique situation, then saying everyone needs to do something like philosophy is not saying everyone needs to think the same way, but that they need similar tools, right? Like it doesn't matter, if you're dealing with a nail, whatever particular person you are to your difference, to say you need a hammer for that is not totalitarian. It's simply a response to the facticity of the nail, right? Now, the kind of hammer and the way you swing the hammer and what kind of tool, that can all fall within your customization and individuation. But to say that there is a range of a tool that is needed to deal with that reality is not totalitarian, right? Well, if reality in its very facticity now is complex, it is emergent, it is pluralistic, it is globalization, and philosophy is the tool as a commitment and mode needed for that, then to say everyone needs something like philosophy is not saying everyone needs to read Aristotle. It's to say that everyone is able to think in the kind of mode we see exhibited by Aristotle. Philosophy is not saying, oh, everyone needs to go read Aristotle. A lot of people that read Aristotle are not good at philosophy. They are good at telling you they've read Aristotle, right? A lot of people who have memorized all of the great books aren't necessarily good at discerning an embodied particular situation, right? Just because you read something doesn't mean you are something, right? And so the interest of the liminal web, though, is that the liminal web is not simply telling people you should learn philosophy. It is modeling what philosophical life looks like, which is far more important than reading Aristotle or reading Nietzsche or reading all of these people. I was mentioning, and then I was mentioning to you before, is that Aquinas did not write the Summa Gentilius saying, oh my gosh, some people are going to write PhDs about this. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. He found himself writing the Summa Gentilius because he had no other way to keep up with his thought or to invite other people into his thought to help him think it through in community and to keep up with his thought. There was no other way to construct a ladder to climb up his own making of his own life, right? Schopenhauer has that lovely, I use it all the time because I just think it's grand, where he says a lot of people think that learning is where a man comes up to a ladder and there are rungs on it. He pulls the rungs off the ladder and puts it in a sack and walks around to show off to people all the rungs he has. He's like, no. Learning is about climbing the ladder, dang it. And you leave behind some of the rungs. You forget what Aristotle, but you climb the rung and you leave it behind, but you're climbing, right? That's what it's supposed to be. But none of that is clear what it means just saying it. You need a model. You need to see it. Well, that's now possible with the liminal web, which to me is a social coordination mechanism, like the pricing mechanism that was never before possible in history until now. Now people can see, oh, this is what they mean by philosophy. This is what they mean by dialogos. This is what they mean by circling. I see it because humans, it's just to your work, we don't tend to learn by information. We need to see bodies acting. We need to see people doing things. Now I get it. It's a mode. It's a kind of circling, a kind of orbiting that Sindler will talk about, right? Oh, so the liminal web, almost more like that modeling as a medium, you could say is almost more important than the information, the modeling of dialogue. But the funny thing is what you see, basically the liminal web showcases that once you get into these complex issues, like these big issues, you just find yourself using philosophy, not because you go into the conversation saying, I want to be a philosopher. You find yourself using those tools because they're bringing to the forefront things. And that's why it also has a certain genuineness to it, where when you go to an academic conference, everyone is there to show off the philosophy they read, to read the papers they wrote about it, right? There's an intention. And that intention of the academic conference can kill the feeling of genuineness or genuine exploring. The liminal web, just like we don't know what we're talking about. We're going to see where you go, right? And let's just introduce and go. That makes it real because it feels like jazz improvisation, right? And then when people are able to see, oh, they're just grabbing philosophy or theology or life experience or embodiment because that's what they need to keep this thing alive and to go where you... Now I see what the love of wisdom is. Now I see what it means to love wisdom as a model. So to me, and then if so much of our problems today and you'll hear this from lots of people, where we don't have culture, we don't have meaning, we don't have the mode of consciousness, we need to elevate consciousness, all of these different things that people are saying. All of that seems correct. And of course, the problem is your society is actively training you to modes of thinking just by the environment, right? Like when you, James K. Smith says, when you go to the mall, it's working on your loves. You know, environments are working on your loves, right? So you're always actively being trained into the society, into a certain mode of consciousness, right? Well, if there's a need for elevated consciousness, which, you know, can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but as a general phrase, it's valid. If we need elevated consciousness, and human beings tend to gain modes of consciousness based on what they absorb, not what they're told, well, then you need to offer an architecture modeling an alternative mode of consciousness, or else you're not going to address all these problems. And that's what the liminal web can do, because it can show an alternative way of thinking and talking and model. And then also, too, if you're sitting at home and you see it, you're like, oh my gosh, there are people who are actually learning for learning's sake. Like you were told that your entire life, learn for learning's sake. What does that look like? Because you, teacher, are learning to get paid. You're not learning for learning's sake. The professor at college telling you to learn for learning's sake, you're like, are you learning for learning's sake? But no, it's good. Lifelong learning. But you're getting paid for lifelong learning. What do you mean? Oh, and if you go off and work and like drive trucks, where's your community to do lifelong learning? How are you going to do that unless you just happen to live around a college, right? It's geographically bound, right? Maybe you do a reading group here and there, but then you have kids. What time do you have to go to the reading group, get the kids in the car and go, right? All of these logistical challenges arise. Well, the liminal web shows the possibility of communal lifelong learning that models a mode of consciousness that is logistically feasible and also inherently diverse, because many people of different jobs and locations can do it realistically, thus socially coordinating the emergence of modes of consciousness that are actually adequate by which to possibly address global pluralism and the complexity that we are seeing. That does indeed seem to require a lifelong learning, but until this infrastructure, this social coordinating mechanism, the infrastructure was not there to model it and to show people how to do it and to give them an invitation to participate in it. So that's one of the reasons I do it, that I do think it's important, and it's an opportunity to meet people like you, because I would have never met you without this, and that would have been sad. So, you know, that's another important part of it, but let me throw it back at you.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Well, you covered so much ground there, and you know, I feel like saying, if someone's watching right now, first of all, maybe some people don't make it this far when they see a conversation like this, but what we're calling the liminal web, where these kinds of conversations can happen, for me, I think there were subjects that drew me in. You know, there's captions under the videos. But I think part of what drew me in was what you're describing, is this love of learning, and people not explaining it, but modeling it, because there's a sense of, oh, I'm watching this video. It's even, maybe I'm even looking at my screen and there's something that I think isn't good about that. But somehow these people on this screen, they feel a little more alive to me than so much else of what's coming through the device. It feels human. It reminds me of my own humanity, right? And we spoke before we started with the recording a little bit about, I was just kind of giving some of my background, including in relation to music, because it would still be fun to hear about some of the novel approaches you've had with the piano. But what I was saying to you is, and then I extended this to sort of reading the great works, including, you know, the philosophical works or the literary works, is that I think at a young age, I kind of did get turned off by school. And I'm someone who, you know, for a number of years in elementary school, I got good grades. I understood that that was part of how I would be valued in my family, and that, you know, if friends told me I was smart, I kind of liked how that felt, and I wanted to see if I could keep that going. But the love of learning for that feeling of learning itself, which I think we might call play, right? But we sometimes think when we're growing up that, oh, play is only what I do on the jungle gym at recess. That's play, and what happens in the classroom couldn't possibly be play. And then, but it's so then what you just were describing as we were sort of talking about the liminal web, and you're giving some of your background too, and I'm trying to condense things a little bit. but the world is complex, right? We might wish for it to be less complex, but it is what it is. And so there's a certain ignorance if we say philosophy is too complex and that's why I don't want to deal with it. I mean, it might be understandable sentiment on some level, but the more we look at it, like you say, we can talk about elevating consciousness, but then we have to have a conversation. What do we even mean by that? And yet, most of us would like to kind of have less sense of, I don't know what's going on in our lives, because that's really, that's what makes us anxious. That's what stresses us out. That's what sometimes leads us to be a short fuse and say something we wish we hadn't said to our loved ones. And so, and I think that I haven't read David Hume, but when you're talking about isness and suchness, what I'm understanding is you're just saying, look, there are categories and definitions, and there are those great thinkers that are going to take time and energy to study, and you can fight with the feeling of I'm getting it right or I'm getting it wrong, and then I don't feel. But in the end, it does relate to your life. It's not arbitrary, but much of our experience, I'll just throw out a big sort of plural us. I think so many of us have had a negative experience with trying to wrap our minds around the great thinkers, who in addition might just be writing 200 years ago. So that's already difficult for me to get through a paragraph because this isn't how we talk now and that kind of thing. So just the last thing I want to mention for the sake of anyone listening, because we haven't done it much justice so far, is what Aspasia brought to both of us, this question of authentic resonance. This is shorthand, but it had something to do with successfully, quote in quotes, or at least feeling successful in navigating all the complexity that I find myself in day-to-day life. And there are those moments. I think she was in particular focusing on a moment of resonance where it just feels like, just like the word in music, something resonates and it's resonating clearly. And it's maybe a moment where my life is complex, but for just that one moment, it feels simple. And there might be a lot of work that I need to do that involves struggle and strain to get to that moment. But then I think the additional thing that she's saying is that we can learn to recognize those moments, because maybe sometimes we stumble into them and we don't get to say later, well, I did everything right and that's why. It's more like I got lucky and I experienced resonance. But this is the place where I think the body works faster than the mind. And I mean, we could talk about body and mind. I think there's, the place where one becomes the other is quite blurry. I think but they are useful words. Yeah. So anyway, I just want to I feel myself imagining people who are listening, and if they're with us or they're not with us, if you're still listening, I would just say part of the ride, maybe we can take a little more pleasure in what I don't understand, and then keep dancing and just see where there's some momentum here. And that might be more in the body. It might be the mind that says, aha, I know the answer. But I think if we were also able to take a little more satisfaction in how this feels at a given moment, that has something to do with the authentic resonance.
That's very well put. Well, there's a few things. First, we have unfortunately been habituated to associate learning with instantaneous get and memorization, whereas classically learning was indeed lifelong. So it was a continual conversation you let wash over you, that of course you don't get it all. That's the mystery. And what is it that Vervaeke and Shin, all these people are saying that one of the causes of the meaning crisis is the loss of what? Mystery, the apophatic, the sense of something greater than yourself. Well, if we were not subconsciously habituated to be like, I don't understand, I'm going to do bad on the test, I don't like this, well, then you would actually be more in your body able to enjoy that feeling, right? It is a great disservice that we have done to human beings to make them be trained in education to not feel enjoyment and the going with the flow, with the surfing. Because that also you kind of in life need to hear things you don't understand to know that there's something to investigate, right? Like, it's like, that's part of the joy of it, right? It's like, if you knew Blondel has a lovely line where he says, it's funny, in modern philosophy, the goal is certainty, but everything we're certain about, we don't care about. Like, when you're certain about something, you don't pay attention to it, right? Like, if you know the doorknob works, you don't think about it. You only think about things when you're not certain. So what he's pointing at is modern philosophy and education in general, honestly, has a kind of self-destructive goal. Like, if you actually, in learning, get the knowledge that learning is supposed to be about, you no longer care to learn. Because, okay, I know it, right? Isn't that exactly what has occurred? And so basically, too, certainty and boredom go together. And boredom, Patricia Sachs talks about the birth of boredom in philosophy, starting with like Pascal. You can get into the 18th century, but also with that, the modern project of certainty comes to the forefront as well. And I think those things are connected. Liz Newbegin, in his lovely book, Proper Confidence, basically says what causes nihilism is certainty, because there is no such thing as certainty. And even if you do get something like certainty, you stop caring, right? So care is a product of experiencing things that have a bit of mystery to them, a little bit of not getting it all. And that's what makes you care. But here's why modern education in a way is so destructive, is because precisely that feeling or range of the possibility of care is what you've been taught to think means something's wrong. So you don't enter that place where you can experience care and love and, ooh, interesting, oh, wow. Because going in means you go into a feeling of not knowing, and you are subconsciously in your body because you had the anxiety of not knowing the answers on the test. And so you've like, you don't enter the space where care is possible. Like this. And so then, of course, you get a meaning crisis and nihilism and boredom and all these different things, because people have been subconsciously trained not to enter into these spaces where care develops. Because like when you look at religious traditions and different things, like they're always like, the whole idea of God is everything we learn, there's infinitely more we don't. Like, why are people going to church, listen to the same parable for decades upon frickin' decades? Is because I don't get it. And actually, the more I get, the more I find there's more to get and different things. All of this is the mode that is a prerequisite for any possibility of lifelong learning and any possibility of the enjoyment of thinking, of which, here's the trick: if you do not enjoy thinking, if you don't care, if you don't feel care from thinking, how you will never, ever, ever get to the place to handle the complexity of life. Because the demands of the complexity of life are such that unless you enter some kind of intrinsic motivation, you simply won't put in the time to rise to its occasion. And if you don't rise to its occasion, your discernment will be worse. You'll be more manipulatable by the media, by what other people tell you. Like I should know, philosophy also has, I think, another role of it is self-defense. Like David Hume is big on this. Like when you hear bad ideas or propaganda or people are telling you what you ought to do with your life, if you don't have philosophy, you will find it very difficult to self-defend yourself from propaganda, or when people are telling you the world's going to end, like Paul Virilio, Constant Emergency. I think anxiety and mental health are greatly at risk if you do not have mental self-defense mechanisms. And that means you're able, this is where deconstruction, the good of deconstruction is if you're using it as self-defense. The problem is we've used deconstruction on ourselves. And so then that's no good, right? Deconstruction, for Derrida, who is different from many of the deconstructionists, his whole idea was that deconstruction was about justice, where you were going to be liberating people and freeing them. It was not about nihilism. It was about deconstructing premises that were putting people in bondage. James K. Smith has a lovely book on Derrida. Well, similarly, philosophy is about self-defense. When you, so for example, if you make life choices where you say, I'm going to commit to X, and you put all your time into X, I guarantee you someone's going to come along and say, that's stupid. How are you going to make money? What are you doing? Why are you doing that? If you do not have self-defense, psychological, mental self-defense from that, you're going to probably, one, either blow up on that person who may just be asking an innocent question. You may become, you're right, this is stupid, and give up on what you're doing. You may emotionally go through turmoil. There are all sorts of trouble you will undergo if you do not have self-defense. And this is also the philosophy that provides the self-defense is also defending the clearing in which you can have the love of learning. You are defending the clearing in which this care and love of learning can occur. right? And so again, this is what philosophy is supposed to be about. It's the love of wisdom, and then of course the defense of wisdom. If you love something, you defend it, right? You care about it. You lay down your life for it, right? So the love of wisdom also entails a defense of wisdom, where you're defending the space of your lifelong learning, of your commitment, of your absolute choices, I will call it, which little foxes will come and try to steal, right? Like things will cut, like thieves will break in the night and steal, put your heart, where it will not rust and consume and moths consume and all that. But the problem is,
just jump in. I was smiling because you were like describing passages in my life to me just now, so I teach the Feldenkrais method. And for many people, they'll just hear that and they'll say, what is that? Right. I happen to think it's brilliant. Here you have this physicist who becomes a black belt in judo, and then he injures his knees and he figures out how to rehabilitate himself. At a certain point, he realizes, but it's also not just my body, it's my nervous system, it's psychology. And he defines health. He says actual health is living your unavowed dreams, right? So he understands that it's not just my bones and my muscles and my joints, it's my everything. And yet movement is, integral to everything I do, even though I live in this world of words. And he even he understands that at the same, that even if I think I want to do gymnastics or I want to play tennis, and I think this is all about body mechanics, that actually, everything we've been talking about in terms of philosophy, say, is also going to be part of the learning process with movement. So I go to, learn how to hit a tennis ball, and I find it's so awkward to hold the racket, that I feel awful, and I'm not even sure I want to show up the next day. And so, he sees that it's a human being inside this body trying to do physical tasks. And he models his entire, or he designs his entire approach to learning around understanding that we overdo it, or we have a critical inner voice. And he incorporates all of this into how do we even approach movement. So I find this at a certain point in my life when I've been through the sort of ringer of this educational system, which, I had some successes in school, but I did not pop out of college with a career, right? And so that was like a whole thing I had to deal with. And at a certain point, what really helped was not trying to figure it out by thinking the correct thoughts that I'd never thought before, but it was beginning to feel my body in a particular way, which then kind of cleared the space maybe to think in a new way, because I could feel. There was a period where I worked in a factory, and I remember thinking, gosh, I feel so good. And it wasn't just my body, but it was like a sense of I can be successful with this task. Whereas growing up, I had a prejudice against a person who would work in a factory. Well, that's not, if you're living a good human life, you're using your intelligence and your brain, and that's what's generating your income or something like that. When I was in a situation where that wasn't the primary value, and I got to have another value, I just felt valuable. And I thought, this is great, and so anyway, I kind of wanted to jump in when you were talking about that. But the other thing I want to just reflect is you're clearly someone who's done deep reading and really a lot of thinking and systemized your thinking to the level that you can write books and you can explain the kinds of things that you've already said here today. But it's also clear that you love it. And I'd be curious just to use this as an excuse to go back to the beginning and get some more of your backstory, because you're on a farm right now, and it's your family has a farm, and you've been on so that goes back. You also told me that you had a photography business, and there was another thing which I'm forgetting, but there's the piano. So because I feel like you're modeling it. And I really appreciate the idea that modeling does something, because I believe that the world mirrors us. Like you mentioned, we go to the mall, and if that's the mirror of my life, it's like, oh, this is really decrepit, and there's no life here. But then I think, is this my life? But if I can say so, you seem to have succeeded in cultivating the love of learning. And so I'd love to just get a little more of your background and maybe with a little extra accent on the sort of, I don't know, the way that you've been in the world as a body. In addition to your academic training, I would love to hear something about that.
Well, that was all magnificent. So, a few things that come to mind that I think tie. The painter Cézanne was, famous for like looking at a bowl of fruit forever. And his whole idea was it's really, really, really hard to actually see something. Seems easy, but actually it's really hard. Philosophy is at its best when it's helping you see. And the issue is you don't realize how often your ideas are getting in the way. But then also you wouldn't be in the place where you could see something without ideas. And likewise, you need ideas to provide the, dare I say, coordination or notion of the conditions necessary for seeing. And if you get to the place where you're actually able to see that bowl of fruit, when someone comes along and says, why are you looking at fruit? That's stupid. If you don't have self-defense, you're going to go away and lose that vision, right? Philosophy is at its best when it is tied, in my opinion, to the arts, phenomenology, and experience. When it's very hard to experience. Like, you start off born having experiences, instincts, and different things. So David Hume would say the problem with that is it's impulsive and it's not cultivated, and it is not able to have higher quality. So you have to go through the philosophical journey in order to gain those capacities, but now you're at risk of losing experience. The return to common life, the return to experience is where you've gone through thinking to actually be able to have experiences that you otherwise could not have and to be able to defend it and to commit to it, and to share it. But you have to have that return. You can't start, you have to return to where you start, the place of our beginnings to know it for the first time, as Eliot put it. And that's very important. And I guess you could say that I was convinced of that case in my life, that I was convinced that you couldn't stay where you started, but you also could not avoid returning to some sort of commitment. Now, that doesn't mean you return to the literal place that you were born or something like that. Some people do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But it means a certain commitment. Returning to the place of embodiment, of common life, of actuality, and using what you learn in service of that, even if it's wrong. Even if you go down and you make a mistake and it's not right and you should have made a better choice, nevertheless, you commit and you take that risk. Because if you don't take risk, how will you create value, right? Because if you want certainty, well, how do I know this is the best choice? You don't. That's why it can be beautiful. If you want certainty before you make a choice, then you will not make choices until you're a nihilist. That's what Blondel teaches us. And we're actually, unfortunately, taught that you should not make choices until you're certain. Well, that means you can't make choices until you lose the humanity that makes choices worth making. It's a great mistake that education has set us for. Ivan Illich, if I were to summarize the great Ivan Illich, he warns that we live in a world where everything is, the smart person plans their life. They know everything that's going to happen. They have a plan. Actually, no, being a human is about being prepared for life. You don't plan away the future, you're prepared for the future. Preparation has a demand on the character and the person that is far greater than planning. Planning is what a robot does. Planning can predict the future in a model, so it's not by chance now that an artificial intelligence is going to replace a humanity or could replace a humanity that does nothing more than plan the future. Well, of course, AI can do that better. But if it comes to be prepared for the immediate and the present and the surprising and the encounter and the other and the Levinas face, AI can't do that. But we haven't wanted to do that because it's hard. Well, then we better come to terms with that real in a Lacanian sense, right? So for me, another thing I'll say that got me into philosophy. So I grew up walking in the woods, vanishing for many hours, going through the mountains. We live on a farm. I only came home after dark once because it was one of the dumbest moves of my life. I miscalculated how long it would be to get to the top mountain. And when I came back and mom was in her chair on the porch, I went, oh great, I'm gonna die. Only once, but walking in the woods. And then one Christmas, my beloved aunt said, well, you ought to take pictures of where you're going. This was like 11, so she gave me a camera. And that's where I started the photography business, Frozen Glory Photography, and taking pictures. And I did galleries and weddings and did that for a long time. And then
cultivating that seeing that you were talking.
Yes, sir. The other thing too is I was very fortunate to grow up. Every Friday I would meet with a man named Mr. Roy Dillard, and there was the big T, and probably did that for 8 or so years. And I never thought it's not like I said, I want to do philosophy. That's not what you did. You found yourself just having conversations that then people would come along and say, oh, you like philosophy. What? Oh, is that what this is called? Like, that's how philosophy is supposed to be. It's supposed to be something you don't intentionally do, you just find yourself doing. And that's how it was with these men talking, they were talking whatever they were talking about, theology, politics, etc., so forth. And, JB, Bobby, I can think of all these people having these discussions, which for me, it was not, I want to do philosophy. It was if this is so, then this would follow, then this would follow, then this would follow, right? Where it just led into it, right? If you just keep following the line of thought, right? And also it was engaging because like, oh, it's not just like, what's the weather, Paul? What's the sports game, Paul? Not that small talk can be extremely important. I'm not trying to demonize it or anything like that. But it's that ability of, oh, bounce, 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 bounce. That has a different quality to it. And also, it didn't seem to me as if when you get into these topics that you were discussing, that if you didn't keep going, there's a kind of inauthenticity to it. There's a kind of like, well, you're cutting it off before you finish, right? So that wouldn't be good. You need to follow it. Clifford would call that epistemic responsibility. You need to be epistemically responsible to see where it goes, right? But it wasn't ever something where I was like, oh, I want to do philosophy. That's just where you had to go if you were going to talk about that issue, right? Like if someone says America's about freedom, well, what's freedom? That doesn't seem like a jerk move. That just seems like a necessary thing you'd have to ask if that statement was meaningful, right? But it wasn't like, okay, let's do philosophy. It's like, oh, okay, so, well, what is freedom? That's not a jerk move. It's just what you would ask next. I also grew up writing Miss Sanborn, 5th grade. There was an assignment to write a short story, and I started writing a story called The Sword of Tribulation that then turned into like 30 pages, and it was a chapter, and I just started writing a science fiction book, and then did that for 11 years. And I think that also got into it because you're thinking of the plot. You're thinking of oh, how do I have like an interesting idea? And there's something about good story structure that I think is isomorphic to philosophy, right? But it's for the sake of making something engaging, something fun, something beautiful, something, dramatic or different things, right? So you're bringing thoughts together in order to create an experience, right? And I actually think the best philosophy does that as well. That's where Sindler, with Vivek, with Plato, like the Platonic dialogue it's not merely the ideas, it's also an experience, a model of a certain experience of thinking that is being put forth there. So science fiction, I think also another thing that happened, a ground of philosophy is that it was increasingly clear, I guess the first thing that somebody said, my grandmother once said something, because my grandfather lived next door, so I would sit on the porch and we'd eat watermelon all the time because I adore watermelon. And one time, and I think my dad said the same too, at one point they said something like, nobody gets married expecting to get a divorce. And that sounds very like, okay, obviously. But actually, to me, that was a really big deal because you go, wait a minute. When people get married, they genuinely believe they're going to spend their lives together. They genuinely would do anything just to glance at this person. And then they get to the point where they hate them more than anyone. How is that possible? How is that possible? It must mean the brain is actually not what you think it is. That's how it hit me. It must mean, wait a minute, that means I can't trust my brain. So, whoa, the very thing I need to think is something that will set me up for failure. That to me was a very big deal. And then looking around, it seemed like in relationships or friendships that people were constantly unintentionally getting in fights or disagreement or hurting one another. But these are friends. They don't mean to hurt one another. So it must mean that their mechanism of understanding their situation is leading them to make decisions that is setting them up for drama and stuff they don't mean to get into. Well, that means we can't just go along with what we're thinking. That doesn't mean we can't just go along, right? There's something we have to think about how we think because it seems to be setting us up for trouble, right? Because the other issue is there's no such thing as a bad intention. Like Augustine makes this point. Like if you intend to do X, you think it's good to do X. Even if it's like killing someone or hurting yourself, then you think it's good to do those things, right? There is no such thing as a bad intention. There is a bad result, but if you intend something, you must think it's good. Oh my gosh. But wait, lots of good intentions make bad results. Oh no. So the very intention we have to make choices is unreliable. So what it did for me is it created a sense that our mechanisms that are necessary for operating in the world are not reliable, okay? But that didn't lead me to nihilism, though, because it was clear to me that it is possible to work through these things, right? On a personal level. But then it also became clear to me that most personal advice or counseling or self-help was not intricate enough. It was actually too shallow. And actually, it was like philosophy is actually, well, the greatest philosophers are responding to something they've experienced. They're not just saying, ooh, let me come up with some cool ideas about beyond good and evil, like Nietzsche or something. No, he is seeing how people are defining good as the opposite of evil and avoiding taking responsibility for their own choices by simply saying, I'm going to do the good, right? And then getting power from it, right? It's something he's seen that leads to pathological social consequence, right? And so likewise, to me, it became clear that a lot of advice on relationships that was supposedly good advice, rather from a church, from a counselor, or et cetera, so forth, was not of the depth sufficient and necessary to help people avoid their own mechanisms of irony, self-destruction, self-deception, unintentional good intentions. And then also another critical dimension, it was as if people couldn't see one another. It's like they literally could not see what was happening in front of them, right? They were literally blinded by their ideas, right? So those observations of people, and then actually genuinely seeing how philosophy, arts, beauty, all these things genuinely help with these things. That also makes you love it because you're like, oh, it actually works. Like if you actually think if you literally do philosophy in the way we are describing, not just reading the books, but actually the mode of being, it literally will improve the quality of your relational conversations. It will give you, like Michelle and I will talk about meta talks, like the ability to, in a couple, talk about the conversation itself, not just in the conversation, and how that capacity is a huge freaking deal, right? C.S. Lewis has, and I'll give it back to you. C.S. Lewis has this lovely, I think it's meditation in a tool shed, where he talks about he walks into a tool shed and he sees this ray of light coming through the roof, right? And he says there's looking at something, and then you step into the light and look through it, and then there's looking through the light, right? So there's looking at the light and then looking through. And he said the key to being human is being able to do both, right? There are times when you need to look at the light outside of it, and then there are times you need to look through it, right? The problem is most of the time we're looking through something, and so our frame is stuck that we can't look at it. And if you can't look at it, if there is a conflict or disagreement that is happening looking through the light, well, then you're just going to keep reiterating the conflict. You need to take a meta step outside of it to then work on, right? Likewise, if there's something wrong in your body that is hindering your mental health or that is keeping you out of alignment, you can think all day long. If you don't do the work of your body, it's not going to make a difference. That ability to identify when meta steps are needed is a huge deal. And if you cannot take meta steps in all of these different areas, you better hope whatever you're in is set for life, because you're stuck in that trajectory. Like whatever that trajectory is, you're stuck in. And so to me, that was all where philosophy, well, in a way, philosophy just became, in a sense, non-optional if you wanted a higher quality of life. Like if you wanted, well, let me put it this way. A way I've put it in thoughts is philosophy is like a fire extinguisher. Do you need a fire extinguisher all the time? Is the point of your house a fire extinguisher? No. But when you need a fire extinguisher, if you don't have it, you could be in big trouble, right? So I think philosophy is quite similar. Philosophy is not the main thing. It is a mode that allows you to maintain the main things and to see well the main things. But when you need it, if you don't have it, and I think it's basically incredibly unlikely that you won't need it at some point of your life, especially under global pluralism and complexity and media and all of these different things, you could be in massive trouble, right? And so there's something about philosophy as self-defense. See, like if you don't have that ability to, wait a minute, I'm losing the capacity to see this bowl of fruit. Wait a minute, I'm losing the capacity to see what's in front of me. Wait a minute, I'm losing the capacity to metastep. If you don't have that ability, the fire extinguisher, the consequences can be incredibly, incredibly dire. And so to me, it was simply not a good bet, if you will. It was not a good bet to not do philosophy. And then also, Alan Bloom, at the end of The Closing of the American Mind, said something very odd that he didn't really elaborate on, but I think it's actually extremely important. He says something like this. He says, without the humanities, friendship is impossible. What? Like, you can't actually have friendship without the humanities. And he just kind of closes it. And he says the role of, like, college is actually to teach the humanities. You're like, what do you mean? And please note, following books like Lost Connections and all of that, we do seem to have a friend session, right? It also became clear to me that people who engage in the humanities or philosophy seem to have, like, very engaging conversations with one another, wanting to see one another. Oh, and they didn't have to spend money all the time to be with one another. Because if you don't have conversational skills, how do you hang out with your friends? Spending money, right? Well, that's not good. Or unless you have infinite money. And if you do, great, great. But philosophy also, what was interesting is like, wow, people who have, there's a certain engagement that makes this, all they want to do is sit around a table for 8 hours. We see this all the time on the liminal web. People are talking for 4 hours. It's like, what the heck? Like, that's friendship. That is a quality of friendship, okay? And so also, there is something about philosophy that enhances relationship. Because what did Pascal said? He said, all the world's problems can be summed up by the fact that people can't sit alone in a room for 3 minutes, right? They can't do that. There's something about philosophy that helps you, one, be able to see the beauty of the room so you can be there alone. And then if there's somebody with you, but what he means by alone is going off and doing something and consuming or whatever, right? Talking is great because you can do it anywhere, at any point, non-contingently. And if you can figure out ways to enhance the quality of your discussion, that is a wonderful way to enhance relationships. And what do they say all the time about relationships? They're about what? Communication. Too bad we're really bad at communication and we think we're good, but the problem is our brain convinces us we're good at it, right? Because you can't take the meta step to realize you're bad at it, right? So there's also something about philosophy that self-defense, it's I think a good risk strategy to be good at it. It helps you see. It helps you have better relationships. It helps with friendships. And it also helps reality disclose in a way that makes you care about it more, precisely because it adds an element of mystery. And I would just say that my story and life and stuff, led into those kind of encounters.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's beautiful. And you did use the word philosophy many times, and you mentioned these thinkers, but I really did feel the embodiment of what you were talking about. The list of benefits that you just gave, the bullet points of why philosophy helps us. I want to say this is the same reason why people should do embodiment practices, right? Why they should try something like Feldenkrais, or this is why the meditation or yoga or these. I mean, there's so many practices. People will do different ones, but so I wanted to go back to this moment where you're having watermelon on the porch and someone says, you don't marry someone just to get divorced. And what it sounds like is this was a moment for you where some of that self-defense came in. First of all, you kind of paused, and there was just, and this could be also Aspasia's authentic resonance. You're hearing all kinds of words. Maybe it's already a good experience on the porch with the watermelon, but then those words come into your ear. And I kind of want to highlight the physicality of it, right? Because we can forget that two people speaking are, resonating in their throat. There's, as I speak, and I'm appreciating this while you speak, there's the rhythm of my speech, there's the gesture, there's the dance of it, And in the moments when you say something that might strain my, thinking mind to, do I understand? I think it's the enjoyment of the dance that keeps me there, right? But it sounds like something happened there. And when you said that philosophy it can play the role of self-defense, it's the moment where I realize I need a fire extinguisher. It's also, if I were to flip over to something, under the umbrella of embodiment practice, what it sounds like is it's just the moment to pause. Like, when someone's stressed out, the first piece of advice you give them is like, okay, let's just pause for a moment, and then if I pause, Suddenly I can see things that I couldn't see when I'm full of this momentum and I'm trying to figure out all the problems at once and I'm overwhelmed. But it sounds like this pause is also the moment of philosophy, right? But I would argue that philosophy or even just the everyday problem solving, when I realize something's not working, it works better when I can feel my feet on the ground. It works better when I'm aware, or maybe not even consciously tracking my breathing, but like I am breathing. My body is in such a state that I'm not, holding my breath, because that's also going to inhibit the thinking mind. And what sounds like happened for you is, and I don't know if this is another aspect of authentic resonance, just for anyone who's seen the previous two discussions, but it sounds like because you remember that moment all these years later, it was what we call a turning point. And it sounds like you kind of readjusted the dials of your body. And yes, your thinking mind, you might have written in a journal, there's ways to summarize it in words, but it sounds like you took a different approach from that point on to seeing, to being with another person. And again, I can tell you with words how I do that, but it has something to do with how I inhabit my body when I'm with you. So I just noticed that, you were talking about C.S. Lewis and looking at and looking through, and I just wanted to like highlight in the air the word look, and to point out that that's an embodied, there's metaphor in looking at and looking through, but when I try to look at you and then I decide to look through, or whatever context I might switch. I mean, that's an adjustment I probably make in the muscles of my eyes and the tone of my body, and something that we might say is more mental, but has embodied consequences, is my expectations. So it sounds like in that moment of sort of hearing these words of wisdom from an elder about marriage, you also said, I'm going to recalibrate my expectations. And that recalibration must have just rippled through your life in a huge way. So I just kind of wanted to go back and flesh out, so to speak, that moment, because even when we think we're just doing something with mind, the body is there. And when we just think the body is in the lead, there's still something there's a mental model that put us here, in a way. Yeah, I could say more, but I'll pause there.
No,
Yeah.
that's magnificent. Well, a few things, they will say that philosophy starts in wonder. The key to wonder is it's outside of you and it suspends you. Wonder is not something that you think yourself into. You're going about your business and it appears. It's an encounter and it's beyond you. So it's fundamentally embodied. Like you feel it in your body, and there's a certain suspension that occurs. And you suddenly realize, wow, the world can disclose itself this way, which is physical, which is embodied, which is in common life. I think philosophy, we'll talk at the net sometimes about philosophy based on the encounter, the surprise, the limit, the coming upon. All of these are actually, in my opinion, philosophy has been in massive trouble when it's been based on hypotheticals, which are not embodied, they're hypotheticals, or there be efforts for formal systems. Philosophy, and I think David Tracy said this at the beginning of one of his books, it's like philosophy needs to be based on these vivid, explosive like moments that then stand out. And if they happen once, that means they're always possible. And what must reality be like for this thing to be possible? When people talk about the word phenomenology, what that means is a study of how things appear to ask questions about the conditions of reality necessary for them to appear as such. So for example, if that bookcase there is brown, what must reality be like so that I can experience brown? Sure, maybe there's some Descartesian demon that's making me see a bookcase that's not there. I don't know. But whatever is there is disclosing itself in a certain way that then I can ask questions, what must be possible in the conditions of reality to make it so disclosed, right? But that's fundamentally embodied, right? And philosophy always, 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 I think, is best when it's about glimmers, surprises, things you see and then go away, evanescent things, moments of beauty, strikes of beauty. Thomas Jockin and Javier and Michelle, we did a book called The Philosophy of Glimpses. I think the glimpse is the key. to philosophy, not the hypothetical thought experiment, not the fundamental axiom, the glimpse. But that means thought is humble to experience. That's the key. Experience leads to thought, not thought to experience. If you put first things first, you can get second things also. You put second things first, you lose both, as Lewis put it, right? So the experience has to come first. And so I actually think it goes with economics, literature, all of these different things. If you don't put the experience first, if you don't put the lived, you get a lot of unintentional consequences that lead to black swans and well, philosophical melancholia. To me, hearing nobody gets married planning to get a divorce, I should also note an advantage of philosophical discussion is that people are not talking at you. They're just talking about what they're thinking about. Right. This is really important because it allows you to hear things that are not personally directed that you can nevertheless choose to make personal, right? That's another big deal of the liminal web. It allows a experience, like we're talking, and yet this is being recorded, but we're not speaking to an audience because you enter self-forgetfulness where you forget there's an audience, which allows the possibility to overhear, for people to overhear conversations. And one of the big problems with being human is a lot of things you need to hear you don't know you need to hear. A lot of the things you need to know are the ones you don't know you need to know. Oh, shoot. So that means you need a lot of what? Experience, a lot of overhearing, a lot of things happening upon you, a lot of surprises and encounters, right? The liminal web provides a place where people can overhear things that are not personally directed at them that they can nevertheless see their person in. And that's really important. So when you have these kind of these elders or different people that are speaking, they're not speaking at you. They're not saying you did something wrong or they think you need to know this because you're the kind of person. It's just in the air. And that's really important because that allows this incidental absorption, this incidental encounter. That's really big. Here's the point. It seems very unlikely for that to occur without something like philosophy. Like philosophy seems to be what creates the kind of conversation where these incidental, non-directed notions can be heard that can change people's lives, right? Small talk doesn't so much. Why would you in small talk say no one gets married planning to get a divorce? You might. It might somehow come up because you're talking about a neighbor or something, but it seems much less likely. It seems much more inefficient as a social coordination mechanism, right? So this is key, like this secondary incidental, like how would people know that, like if they don't know about body work, for example, the stuff that you're talking about, they also don't know they don't know about it. That's the real challenge. There's knowing, there's ignorance where you don't know something, but then there's true ignorance where you don't know you don't know. Oh, and the problem is when you don't know, you feel like you know everything. That's also the big problem. Like if it felt like you didn't know something when you didn't know something, that'd be great because you'd have a signal to go learn. The problem is when you don't know, and this is Kathy Schultz Being Wrong book, when you don't know, it feels like you're right. And it feels like you're not missing anything. Well, then you're in trouble because you're enclosed, right? You're in a kind of enclosure. How would you break that enclosure when you don't even know you're an enclosure? It has to be a surprise. It has to be an encounter. It has to be something incidental. Ergo, the philosophical conversation you overhear, the elders on the porch, the liminal web. That is the ecosystem. Like overhearing people in a marketplace, they'll talk about in The Rise and Fall of American Cities, Jonah Jacobs, this idea that we've zoned ourselves out of living cities, human geography, spaces where people can overhear things or encounter diversity in different things because of zoning laws. And the Jim Rutt was having a lovely discussion with Pablo about this kind of thing. And then the great book, the Fall of American Cities, like you have to have a human geometry, I think is what Pablo was saying. You have to have this place where you can just bump into and encounter. One thinks of the Silk Road, Randall Collins, networks and different things, right? That's what we're doing on the liminal web. You are creating a space where people can bump into, overhear, think, oh my gosh, I never even thought my problem was not doing body work. I'm so glad that I happened to come upon this discussion that made me know what I didn't know, right? And so that's a big deal. So, that's a thought that comes to mind. But with the issue is that if nobody gets married planning to get a divorce, that would mean, I think most people experience their brain as what solves their problems. Okay, I'm stuck in this body and my brain solves my problems and the body's in the way. It's always getting sick. Let me take some pills. Let me get it. Like the body is sick and bad and the brain is good. What this meant is that your brain was part of the problem too. That the brain was not the solution. The brain was you as a whole were in a problem. But it's not a problem you can solve because that means you're dead. It's a problem you have to manage. And if you manage it, you can encounter the true, the beautiful, and the good, right? So you and your brain is on an equal playing field with embodiment, with experience with the land. Because like you're literally led to believe from school that sit in the desk, get your body out of the way. What is the classroom but a giant indirect signal that you don't need your body, right? You don't. You don't need it. So you are indirectly told your brain is what matters. And that if you follow your brain, you'll be good. The realization was no, 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 no. The brain is part of the problem as well. Oh my gosh, well, what are we going to do? So it actually had a holistic experience, if you will. To me, it combined everything, suddenly was all part of the same dance, if you will. And it was also not self-evident what needed to be done best to address this combinational problem. Well, that right there creates the love of learning, because anything could be part of the conversation suddenly. Anything could be part of what you needed to look into. Architecture, economics, philosophy, photography, walking, bodywork, everything is suddenly on the table. If your brain solves your problems, the only thing you need to focus on are brain stuff, right? Like stuff that makes you use your brain more, right? But if your brain is part of the problem, oh, frick, everything is on the field. Everything is suddenly something you need to pay attention to, because also, if you don't know, you don't know, then if there's something in architecture that could help you, or that could help you deal with the frenemy brain that you have, you don't know it, so you need to go look, right? But here's the other trick. When you have that, for me, with that realization, it didn't turn everything into a kind of nervousness, oh my gosh, I got to learn everything. It turned into everything became a kind of adventure. My experience of it was everything is a kind of adventure, that there's literally an adventure of you. You are a kind of adventure that in going to all of these areas could be, it's not an anxious thing. In fact, to me, the anxiety is not, Kierkegaard once said, and it's a really good line, he said, the man in despair doesn't know he's in despair. If you know you're in despair, then there's hope. The real problem is when you don't know you're in trouble, right? Because you experience yourself not in trouble. And that's actually what ends up happening. One of the reasons I think we like to privilege the brain is because it more actually feels like we're in control. But the real horror, Kierkegaard would say, is the problem with that is you're not in control, but don't know you're not in control, so you're really in trouble, right? And in fact, I think that's why so many people end up in nihilism and hopelessness, is because when the day eventually comes where you need the fire extinguisher, where the day eventually comes where it turns out your brain's not there, you don't know what to do. And you have 30 years of habituating yourself to the wrong road, and you're lost, right? For me, hearing this, before I had invested 40 years in the wrong investment strategy, if you will, then happened at a time where everything turns into an adventure, if you will. Everything is on the table for consideration. And then it also became clear that doing these things, you know how we were saying earlier that a good conversation has a bit of mystery to it where you don't get everything. Everything became a mystery, right? That could be considered and brought out that would then have relative impact on the subject, right? Another way to put it is if you look at a mountain and I said to you, that mountain is unknowable, like you can't know it, then you go, oh, okay, and shrug. But if I were to look at you and say that mountain is unknown, ooh, that sounds fun. The difference between unknown and unknowable is huge, right? And I think a lot of society actually makes everything but your specialization unknowable. Oh, you do economics? Well, you know, literature's off the table for you, right? You're made to feel that everything but what your profession is or what you do or what you're good at is unknowable, right? And so, you know,
well, what's interesting about that is when I discover that something I thought had nothing to do with me is relevant, I notice how it relates to the body, because I sort of tell myself that if it relates to the body, then it relates to what I do, right? And I suppose what you're saying is if the body wasn't how I defined, you know, my work, this could happen for anyone at any vantage point. An example of that, you mentioned architecture. What does architecture have to do with? So architecture is something I don't think about. As I mentioned, I've been studying at the pop-up school with Bonita Roy. And so she introduced me to Christopher Alexander, who I knew nothing about. And I still know nothing about architecture, but this man sort of said, look, you know, the world is incredibly ugly, and this is a problem, you know, and when we build, we need to begin to, you know, listen in a different way to see, like, in a sense, he was dealing with this question of authentic resonance. How can we create a structure, because humans need to do this? We need to shelter ourselves from the wind and the rain, or maybe we want to create a gathering spot. But how can we do it in a way that is in harmony with the land, that isn't violating the land? And then he developed all these ideas of living centers. Like if you look at maybe you look at two man-made objects, a chair, for example, but one of them feels more alive to you than the other. And he even defined this as, well, the one that feels more alive to you, when you look at it, it's like it mirrors yourself a little more than the other. Or we already talked about being at the mall, like that feeling of, oh, you know, but everything's mirroring all the time. And the other thing from Bonnie that I wanted to bring in, because you mentioned there's a reorientation outwards towards the world that can begin to happen. And this is something that she talks about quite a lot. She teaches a particular meditation, which is an eyes open meditation. And if you don't move the eyes and they're soft and you can sort of have the periphery there, it tends to quiet down your thinking. And why? Because I'm absorbed in what's out there. I'm just trying to really, like, I'm thinking of what you said about Cezanne with the fruit. It's like I'm trying to really see, and the way I can distort my seeing is to look at my thoughts, right? Which is a sort of an inward posture. And Bonnie even talks about how you can watch someone's eyes, or you can, there's literally, she uses the word posture both to describe the body and the sort of orientation of our attention, or what we're doing, with our thinking mind. But it does seem to me that this is part of the problem, the infinite problems that we face in this day and age. But the other thing that I thought was really really sweet from what you said, that I think connects to this, is, well, I can use that word problem, but then you also sort of translated that word into adventure, right? So the unknown can be a problem, because if I want certainty, and that's how I define safety, and I think that's what will lead to happiness, then it is a problem when I don't know something. But if it's, a discovery that's just waiting to happen, then it's a totally different orientation. And I think also we could connect that to looking inwards and looking outwards, because the looking inward is kind of like measuring everything based on, if I think this is good for me right now, versus I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I'm going to continue to pay attention because there's more to see. So yeah, there's so many things we've covered, but I just wanted to glance at some things I wrote down before. I'll just pick one of the phrases because you mentioned it again today, and you spoke about this with Aspasia, and it feels like it fits in here. You use the phrase "the phenomenology of the artist," and what I just like to last thing I'd like to say is, like, some people could be listening to this conversation and think, I'm not a philosopher, and therefore I don't know if that's all relevant. And then if we talk about creativity, this is a word that's associated with artists, and a lot of people will immediately excuse themselves. Well, I'm not an artist, or I'm not creative. And then when I talk about embodiment, I've often had people sort of say, well, I'm not connected to my body. And yet I would say you're always in your body. And then the way you've been talking about philosophy, whether I read Nietzsche or not, there is something about everyday life. And what I think you were implying with this phrase, the phenomenology of the artist, is whether or not I think I'm an artist, there's something in everyday life that we celebrate the artist for, but that we all need. And it seems that I don't even know if it's fair to say that the artist is somehow beautifully situated in between the body, embodiment, and philosophy, those practices. Anyway, as you like to say, I'll give it back to you.
No, I'll say I am of the opinion that the artist is a very powerful case study for the space between the body and the mind, if you will, philosophy, and because artists have to do all sorts of things. There's a time of day, there's certain things they can eat, there's certain, like you'll notice they have these certain practices they carry out to bring them to the place where they can do art. They can't just think themselves. What's very interesting about the artists, you'll notice they don't just like think themselves into writing the novel. There are certain conditions they have to meet to be in the space where the art comes out. And that's an embodied thing, that's an environmental thing. And as a note, without going too much into it, a lot of people will talk about subjectivity and objectivity, right? And all of those problems. I think we need to think of what I like to call conditionalism, which is the subject creates certain conditions that then create the possibility of a certain experience. So for example, what's the difference between an open field, like what's a veil? A veil is something that's, if it's too, you can't see through it, it's a wall, and if it's too hard, but then if it's too invisible, it's an open field. So a veil has to meet a very particular condition in order for it to be a veil instead of a wall or an open field, right? So what's a shadow? A shadow needs to meet a certain condition of sunlight, enough sunlight at a certain angle to create it, right? And a lot of actually, I think, again, philosophy based on glimmers and philosophy interested in conditionalism, which are like the shadows objectively require a certain condition, but the shadow itself is not objective, but it is an emergent result of certain conditions that is not arbitrary, right? It's not just like you can make a shadow appear at any point, right? Well, that's a lot of times like art, right? Art is neither subjective nor objective. It can't be simply reduced to one of those. It is some sort of conditionalism. And actually, I think the like thinking is always being conditioned by the human, the body, as mind together. We are perpetually, the reason why language like subjectivity, objectivity, relativism, all of that can be problematic is because we often ask, what do I like versus what am I conditioning myself for? And you see like, it's like, what are my tastes? What are my preference? How do I experience things, right? Well, those are valid, but there's a danger there where you lose sight of your agency in the conditioning that you can have on yourself in a relationship with the outer world and your body and so forth to actually influence the experiences of your tastes and preferences, right? The I is not stable. The I is conditioned. The I is the subject-object divide is nothing, right? It's relations and relatas and different things like that. But also those relations are conditioned. And artists are the reason why I do think artists are between the philosopher and the embodiment or the mind and body is because the artist is in the business of conditionalism even if they don't know it, right? And they also, if they're writing a story, they're trying to do what? Create certain conditions so that when readers read it, there's a certain effect. So they're in a business of creating conditions that make possible experiences that are not automatically given in nature. Like, I don't expect The Sound and the Fury to be made by a tornado. Maybe, I'm not sure. But it has to be conditioned to come into reality, right? And its conditioning is contingent upon William Faulkner meeting the conditions of being capable to do it. So there's this interrelation of conditionalism that is constantly occurring. On what you were saying, on attention and awareness and seeing, and the great Benita on her work, and which brings to mind, she taught on Ivan Illich, and I had the pleasure at Parallaxes doing the same. There's Ivan Illich talks a lot about awareness. Simone Weil talks about attention. McGilchrist talks about attention, right? So there are all these kind of ideas that basically the ability to attend to the world, right brain, human. If you cannot attend to the world, then you're in trouble. You're probably going to be left brain dominant. The way Simone Weil put it is he said, if you're not capable of awareness, then you're going to fall into affliction. And what affliction is kind of self-enclosure, where you're enclosed in yourself. She was kind of a communist and a Marxist at the time, and she goes and works in the factories, and she's like, no, the Marxist revolution is never going to happen because the working class consciousness is afflicted by itself into an enclosure where it can't imagine alternative possibilities. So she abandoned the Marxist project and moved in the direction of a spiritual kind of more of a mystical Christianity direction. Because it was like the key is awareness, but how do you get awareness, right? And she didn't see it happening from the workers' movement. She was seeing it more in the church, right? And but the point is, when she talks about affliction, is that human beings, as she would talk about sin, but I think it's valid, all of us, every single one of us, have a natural tendency toward affliction, toward a self-enclosed logic that cuts us off from what we need for attention. I'll use the word attention because that's what she used, but she means awareness in the idyllic in the McGillicuddy sense, okay? So in the same way that all of reality or the universe tends toward entropy, even though I agree with Deacon and these people talking about negentropy as a result of lack and constraints, but that's a different topic. But there's something about things tend toward disorder, right? Without energy, without effort. There has to be effort, work, as Kaufman will say, to reverse entropy toward negentropy, right? Order versus a lack of order. Human beings tend toward affliction, which is basically what entropy is to the universe. We tend toward an enclosure of ourselves in on ourselves, right? The reason why it's very important to be aware of this is because when we say, well, I'm not an artist, I don't do body work, I don't do these things, that's naturally what humans are going to do to cut themselves off from the possibility of awareness. And so be very, 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 very careful as a human being before you say, I don't do X. Because if you say, I do not do X, you are taking a bet that X is not something that will help you move outside of your natural tendency towards self-enclosure or reflection, right?
I want to just one thing right here, just and give it straight back. But it occurs to me that we live in a world where, on the one hand, you have all these experts, but I think it's so easy for a person to feel ignorant, to feel that I can't do, for example, politics, or I can't do philosophy. So I just want to I give it right back. But what it strikes me, this is a real crux of something that you've talked about. Don't say, or you're not giving instructions, but there's a danger in saying I can't do this, and yet it just feels like there are so. I mean, I feel it viscerally for myself. I'm very aware of that which I cannot do. And it feels like if I imagine some new field of study or picking up a skill I don't have, there's a way that it feels like climbing a very high mountain. So I just wanted to kind of just see what you would respond to that.
Excellent. And I should note, as just the authentic resonance training in that, I do think requires a mode of reality that is unknown versus unknowable, because you're training yourself to make decisions where you don't know the outcome ahead of time. You're getting used to that. So just as a quick note there, to what you just said, this is very important. Okay, so Daniel, are you saying that I should do everything? Photography, piano, every possible thing, right? To resist affliction, the key is not to say I'm going to do everything, because then you become you might become distance without depth. There's a difference between saying I'm going to do everything and saying I will not be closed off to anything. So what you're doing is you're resting in a certain vulnerability and openness, and the key to awareness is you trust whatever the world throws at you, right? You trust, okay, I've had architecture put in front of me, I've had this person put in front of me, and I sense something in my body, or I feel a field, I feel a resonance that suggests that this should be a focus, that awareness should go here, and you give yourself over to it. You trust it, right? So the key is this. All right. So we're saying affliction. There's a tendency of human beings toward enclosure. In order to stop that, you shouldn't close yourself off to anything, so that you're maintaining diligence, awareness. The thief comes in the night kind of thing. You're always diligent. But notice awareness is not that awareness to any and everything is not meaning do everything. It means you are open to what is put in front of you, and you then have the skills and confidence to be able to trust in your ability to see it and make a good decision about it, right? How you should relate to it, to what capacity and to what proportion. But because you've trained yourself into thinking of everything as unknown and a potential adventure versus unknowable, and I just don't do that, then your first move is not to swat it away. Your first move is to what? You said it earlier, and I actually think so much of philosophy is simply this: the hesitancy, the pause. You look at it. One could say that if philosophy may just be one giant study of how to pause, because it's really hard to pause, really hard. But the pause is the difference between affliction and awareness. Not the doing everything, but the pause, which then allows a certain openness and then a choice. But here's the key. Until the social coordination mechanism of the liminal web, we did not have an efficient means of exposing people to things they could be open to better choose. We had the greatest place for that was the city. you go to the city and you encounter experience and you're in the marketplace, right? That the city geographically, in terms of urban design architecture, was where what I'm describing of this, you don't do everything, but you're open to everything, would make the most sense. Because you could do that in a place like that, and you could have encounters, encounterology, as I'll talk about it, which then made this mechanism occur. But here's the problem. That led to everyone moving to cities, expensive, unaffordable housing. It also tended to favor the young, because once you get older, you can't necessarily do that because you have responsibilities. So this mechanism of social coordination that would help people move to awareness and attention out of affliction tended to be geography-based. The other major social coordination system was colleges, right? You go off to college, but the ineffective tendency of that was brain drain. It drained all of the brains out of the small towns in Tennessee. So then you've created this two-tiered society where everyone who has certain capacities are sucked up by the college and they never get home. And then that creates all sort of unintentional consequences. You then have a monopoly on credentials that college have that makes prices go up and they become like very rich and different things. So you get all of these inefficiencies that occur when you have your social coordination based mainly on cities. Then you can get into that book by Jeffrey West on scale, talking about the mega city and all of the unintentional consequences of that. You then also get poor allocation of resources. You then get the college monopoly on credentials and all of those on it. So you get a lot of unintentional consequences, right? The beauty of the social coordination mechanism of the liminal web, it is a far more efficient means by which people can be open and exposed and then make choices within their relative situations that is not so economically burdensome, that is not so privilege dependent, and is things like that, right? And I think that's the key. So what you want to do is you want to be open to anything, body work, architecture, whatever, but you make a decision. This is why it also is going to come back to authentic resonance, because you're open to everything. One of the reasons we don't like to be open to everything, because that means we do have to make a choice. Oh, I don't want that because it feels bad. I don't know how to make choices. So I'd rather close and not be exposed, or just do everything. Because actually, if you just do everything, there's no choice. You just do everything. There is no choice. That's just what you do. Whatever's thrown in front of you, you just do it, right? When you say sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but you're open and exposed to everything and put yourself in the places where you can encounter the surprise, that is much more mentally taxing. That is much more decision taxing, and you've got to be more comfortable with your body and yourself to be able to put yourself in that place where you can make those decisions, right? I think the artist, though, does that. Like, you look at the history, like, that is a practice of the artist. They're putting themselves in the Bloomsburg work. They're going and having different experiences. They're joining different social networks. They're going and doing different things, walking through Dublin so they can memorize it, right? They're going into places and then they are deciding based on their experiences what's going to be put in the story and what's not. And then what is too controversial, what's too philosophical, what's not, constant decision making, to where you get to the place where where you are able to feel authentic resonance when you make a decision, when you don't know the outcome and there's no certainty, right? But that is precisely the quality of decision and character that is necessary to not fall into the nihilism of certainty, the hopelessness of an unknowability, and an enclosure that sets off the possibility of horizons that can turn life into adventure. So gaining that capacity, I think, opens up those horizons. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and it seems like you have to be open in the first place to somehow let that capacity come in, and we can't predict how and where, but it's potentially there for all of us. There'd be so many more places we could go. I know that we're out of time at this point, but just in the spirit of some of what you've said, my sincere hope is that this has been an opportunity for some new people to meet you and to hear about your work. And I'll definitely include information to find out more. I know you write on Substack, and OG Rose is a partnership with your wife, Michelle, right? So that's the pen name for your writing. But yeah, this was wonderful. I just feel very alive and full and inspired to stay more open as a result of being with you today. So thank you so much, Daniel.
It's been a delight, Seth, and I'm sorry for my terrible work obligations, but I'm open to them and making choices about them.
That's
the
right.
Conditioning of subjectivity, and yes, Opperman, Garner, Rose, her mate, Opperman, Garner Rose, and her grandmother's maid was Rose, was the name. So we put those together, Michelle and Daniel. No, I think what you're saying about that initial openness is a massive question. What I would say is right now it seems like you just had to have been lucky and had a good English teacher in high school. How many stories of people having that English teacher, right? You know, man, or just happened to run into those gentlemen in the diner, the big T that changes things. I think that suggests the importance of creating, like you mentioned, the great Christopher Alexander. I think right there, if it is the case that there is a pre-rational, pre-step of being open, then we need to design our cities to have a human geometry. We need to create more beauty. We need to show more communities that love learning and creates more models to increase the probability that people bump into these things that show that the world is more alive than they thought, right? We have unfortunately created cities that are kind of dead. We have created art that is not very inspiring, and we have told people that English is silly, so they never meet that English teacher, right? It is upon us, and it is incumbent upon us to continue to do the work to create more human architecture, to create more human spaces where people are of a higher likelihood to bump into an encounter with the beautiful. Because an encounter with the beautiful, as I will emphasize in honor of Thomas Jockin's great work, an encounter with the beautiful, the beauty says to you, like that Rilke poem, you must change your life, and you are attracted to do so at the same time. It is not a neurotic command of a dictator saying, you must change your life. It is a blessing, and you say, yes, yes, I will. And I think it is upon us to increase those probabilities by continuing to do the work to open those possibilities, such as you are, and having a channel where people can encounter the necessity and value and good of body work. And they didn't even know they needed to know that, but because of the work you're doing, people can see it and thus do it. And that is an example of the kind of thing that it can increase the probability people are open to do the sort of work that we're saying. So I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, and it has been a treat to speak with you, Seth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Take care.
You too, sir. All the best. Thank you.